Hello, class, and welcome to our very first lesson here in a brand new module, a brand new session of the greatest story ever. The name of this session is The Kingdom, the Exile, and the Return. I think this is going to be a really exciting 6 weeks of study for us. We're going to get to go through lots of really, really important and transformational points in the history of the people of Israel and thus God's people in general. I think there's going to be loads and loads of application for us today to think through, to pray through, lessons to be learned from both mistakes and successes of the past. We're going to get to go through lots of really famous characters, big time names that you guys are definitely going to recognize, like Samuel and Saul and David and Solomon, and there's going to be tons of really famous people for us to go through and highlight. So let's go ahead and jump into here our first lesson. And the first lesson here, we're starting out in 1 Samuel chapters 1 through 9. As always, if you haven't gotten a chance to read those yet, I highly recommend reading those first before watching the video. So just certainly pause this and go read chapters 1 through 9. Something that I mentioned to class on Sunday that I think would be helpful to highlight here as well is that if you look at, and if you eventually get, because those of you who weren't here on Sunday, you might not have this in your hand yet, but when you look at the readings for each Sunday, you will notice that they are bigger than they have ever been before. And there's a reason for that, because we are going to try to get ourselves through lots more lots more of the story of the overall Bible here in these 6 weeks than we ever have before. And because of that, I have both skipped more material than I've tried to do previously, and also I've had to increase the number of chapters that we read for each Sunday. So because of that, my recommendation, and of course, do whatever works best for you, but my recommendation is not to kind of put the reading off until like Saturday evening or even Sunday morning before coming to church or something, because there might be too much to get through if you put it off until, and certainly not trying to cram it all into maybe one setting would be helpful. Maybe space it out and do 2 or even 3 different sessions where you get 3 or 4 chapters in at a time. Okay, with no further ado, then let's go ahead and jump into this part of the story, 1 Samuel 1 through 9. What I want to do today is I want to pull back a little bit here before we jump into like specific stories, specific events. I want to pull back and look at this thing more generally. I want to look at it from more of a bird's eye view of what is happening and what God seems to be doing in this part of the people's history in general. And what I want us to do is I want us to go backward a little bit. I want us to think about what we're leaving in the book of Judges. Because what I don't want us to do is I don't want us to think about last session finishing Judges and saying, that's it. That's the end of that piece of history of the people of God. And now we're moving into this part of history of Israel, which is totally separate. Because as we're going to see, these 2 sections of the people's history are very intertwined. They are very commingled. They are, where one ends, the other begins. It's very cohesive, and we're going to see lots of threads and themes that are continuing here as we move into the book of 1 Samuel. So let's start with the end of the book of Judges then, as we actually begin the book of 1 Samuel, because I think this is going to be important for us to see these connections. At the end of the book of Judges, we outlined and we highlighted this incredibly brutally dark downward spiral of the people. And the downward spiral, we said, was marked by a few different problems that continued to escalate, continued to get worse and worse as the book of Judges progressed, as we got deeper into the book. For example, we saw that the people continually turned away from God and began to worship all kinds of false gods and idols that they found around themselves as they encountered the people groups that were already in Canaan, which is what God warned them not to do, right? This turning away from God had some very, very specific and long-lasting consequences. One of which I want to highlight in 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 1. It's almost a throwaway statement. It might be easy to overlook a little statement that's made like this one, but it is very, very impactful in what we're talking about as we look at the story as a whole. The statement there in 1 Samuel 3:1 is, "In those days, the word of the Lord was very rare." And you can see in this small statement the giant impact that turning away from God has on these people. It has caused them to no longer be able to hear the voice of God. They have stopped listening for it, and even if He is speaking, they are not hearing it. And because of that, we see the reason for the downward spiral. We see the cycle, this terrible cycle. We see the reason why, because God is no longer the one who is guiding them and leading them, and they are no longer following Him. They're following their own. Remember the last statement of Judges that was also a very impactful one, where it said there was no king in Israel, and each person did whatever they pleased, whatever they saw as good. So that is causing all of these problems, and I wanted to stop and highlight that. A second thing that we mentioned was as a result of what we found in the book of Judges, we found the people at constant war with those other people groups around them. They're being attacked. They're attacking. It's just constant war and strife, violence everywhere. In class, I mentioned, think about what this does to the psyche of a person. Think about what the people of Ukraine must be going through right now, experiencing terrible, awful war in and among their hometowns, in and among the country that they live. And then think about what if that stress, that violence, that incredible pain and suffering that comes along with the atrocities of war were stretched out over generation after generation after generation. The people of Ukraine having to experience this for months and months and months is awful enough. It is terrible. These pictures I see and the videos that I see currently of what's going on over there. I cannot even fathom that the people of Israel are basically experiencing this through the entire book of Judges. Multiple generations of people. We're talking about decades and decades of war-torn history. And if you think about the people's history moving forward, it doesn't stop there, right? I mean, they have periods of peace, but basically war becomes something that marks the history of the Middle East basically from this time on. And that's something that I think that it's often easy to miss. What this does to a person's psyche, what this does to their identity, what this does to the way that they carry themselves and they see the world. It couldn't be overstated. The immense and massive effect that this would have on a person. So we want to highlight that this is a consequence of the book of Judges and the events that we have read in the book of Judges as we move forward into the book of Samuel. The final thing I want to highlight is that the leaders and specifically the judges are very corruptible, and they have ended up bringing more trouble than they have relief to the people. they have brought momentary, of course, momentary relief in small parts. But the reality is that the relief that they have brought is both very short. It does not last very long. And in the end, especially as we get to the end of the book of Judges, right, we see that the leaders are actually bringing more trouble than they are bringing relief. Certainly, we look at someone like Samson, for example. He is drumming up way more strife, way more problems than he is solving anything. And that just continues to be true. Unfortunately, this may be a plot spoiler, but unfortunately for the people of Israel, this is going to be true as we move into other eras of their history as well. It's going to be true in this section that we're reading today. Certainly when we get into the time of the exile, we will see that that is absolutely true for them. Okay, so a second thing that I want us to think about here, generally speaking, as we move into the book of Samuel. What are the things that we should have learned in the book of Judges? And I say should have learned, again, as a plot spoiler, because I think we're going to see here as we move into Samuel, things that weren't learned. Things that were not learned, but we should have seen. If we were really watching and really pulling out the mistakes and trying to learn from past mistakes, what are the things that we would have seen in the book of Judges? And I have, again, 3 things for us. Number 1, that Israel, and when we say Israel here, let's not get too high and mighty. Let's not put ourselves on a pedestal, because really we're saying humanity. The problems of Israel are the problems of all humanity, and they're the problems of us today as well. Israel and humanity cannot be left to itself, because if it is, it will always turn away from God. It will always disobey God. This is a huge lesson from the book of Judges that we should take to heart. Number 2, human leaders, when we were just talking about this, they can provide temporary relief and salvation, but eventually they too will fail. And the more power you give them, the more likely they are going to be to fail. This is something that we have seen all throughout history, and certainly the book of Judges shows us this as well. And then number 3, because human leaders have failed to bring salvation, what do the people need? They need God Himself to intervene, to rescue them. The good news here, the really good news, is that the people already have story after story after story that shows that God is with them. God has already intervened. God has already saved them from incredible depths of pain and suffering. The entire book of Exodus is this incredible story of God rescuing His people out of the depths of slavery that they experienced in Egypt, and brings them out of that into freedom, and tries to show them what freedom now can look like, and a new identity for them as a people who are loved by Him. The people have these stories. They have them. They're there for them to see and recognize this is what we need moving forward. It is God and only God who can rescue us. And that's the third should have learned lesson of the book of Judges. Okay, so now that we move into the book of Samuel, let's talk generally about what we have read here in these first 9 chapters. God begins here in the book of Samuel to work, to bring Israel out of its brutal depths, to bring it out of this terrible cycle that we finished up in the book of Judges. And how does He do that? Well, let's talk about the ways that God tries to help Israel out of its low point in history, or one of the low points of its history. First, God cleanses the inept and corrupt administration of what? First and foremost, the temple. The the people who are in charge of administrating the worship of God himself. How does he do this? By judging Eli and his sons who are in charge of the temple. We'll come back and talk a little bit more about that. Let's go ahead and move on to the second point. God then installs a better prophet and priest who goes by the name of Samuel. Why? Because he needs someone who will actually hear God's voice and more accurately instruct the people how to walk in God's ways and how to worship God. This is God's plan for rescuing his people. And I think this is super important. We should not miss this. As we think about the culture and the place that we live in today, and we wish that God would come in and just fix the world, I think we should come back and we should look at what God did here in this part of history and say, if God is going to do anything first, the first thing that God is probably going to cleanse and heal and try to put back together is the church. It's the church that probably is going to get judged first, if we're being honest, not the surrounding culture getting immediately fixed. So God does this here in Samuel. Why? Because the plan at this point is for God himself to become king. We talked about this word. I'll write it up here on the board. The word is theocracy. This will be a word in your notes. And the word theocracy here means that God rules, right? The idea is that God is going to become king, and he's going to install Samuel as his prophet and his priest. So Samuel will be the mouthpiece of God to the people. He will speak for the people the will and the guidance and the leadership of God that God is giving to Samuel through his Spirit and through Samuel's prayer with God. However, we see that in this book, this is not what happens, is it? The people have a different plan. And the people's plan is, we would like to have a human king. Now, the big question here is why? Why do the people want a human king? The answer is ultimately a lack of faith in God. And this is the way that God God shows this to Samuel. When Samuel is feeling upset about this, and Samuel says, I feel like I'm being rejected. The people don't want me. They don't want to listen to me. I'm trying to tell them what God says, and they're saying, yeah, that's fine. But it would be better with a human king, someone who's strong militarily. And God says to Samuel at one point in this book, he says, don't take this personally. Ultimately, it's not you they're rejecting. Ultimately, it's me. They are rejecting me as king. So, why are they doing this? We already mentioned the surface level thing here is the people fear. They fear that the other surrounding people groups are going to be stronger than them militarily because they have these strong military leaders, these kings, and the people, they say, we've been following God, but what if God's not enough? What if what it really takes is a strong human leader who can take us where we need to go? Now let's stop and remember, this is absolutely not the answer. We just read an entire book of the Bible, in the book of Judges, whose main point seems to be that human kings, human leaders are not going to get it done. They are going to fail you. They are going to bring trouble, not relief. And yet here the people are, not learning the key lesson from the book of Judges. And they're, at this point, a very recent past, a very recent history for them as a people. They are not going to learn that lesson. Instead, they're going to demand a human king. And we have a very interesting point here of the story where God and Samuel warn them against this, don't they? They spend a lot of time, there are a lot of words that we read for this week of God and Samuel together warning the people against what the people seem to want. And yet when the people continue and demand a king, they relent. And they say, we will let the people have their way. And we will let you see the consequences of going down this road as opposed to another. Okay. Let's take the last a few minutes that we have here then to focus on some specific people and storylines that are very interesting in the story. I want to start with Hannah. Hannah is the person who opens up. Her story is the opening of the book of Samuel, and I think this happens for some very specific reasons. Reason number one, in many ways, Hannah represents her people. She represents Israel as a whole. Specifically here, I'm talking about the fact that she is very distraught. And she feels even hopeless at this point in her own life and the things that she's struggling with and she's got going on. Just like Israel is coming out of a period of extreme destruction, even to the point of hopelessness, out of the book of Judges. For Hannah specifically, being able to bear no sons was extremely difficult for a woman in this time. We mentioned in class how it was a divorceable situation. A man could divorce his wife if she had gone a certain amount of time without bearing him a male heir. Now, we pointed out the ludicrousness of this because, of course, the people then lacked the knowledge that we do from a healthcare standpoint, where we now know that it is the male who determines the sex of the child who is born. So the reality is these guys should have been, I guess, punishing themselves, even though we obviously also know it doesn't even work that way, right? You can't just consciously determine it. But if anyone is at fault, if anyone is responsible for the gender of babies who are born, it is actually the male. It comes from the sperm. So they only had themselves to blame. But unfortunately, they didn't know that back then. And they took it out on their poor wives sometimes and could even divorce them if they had not provided the value of a male heir. So what does Hannah do in this terrible situation? She resolves to turn to God. And she goes to the temple and she prays. And I want to highlight this. Let's notice the order of Hannah's journey here. She's distraught. She decides, I will turn to God in my distress. She prays, and after praying, after receiving the love and the comfort and the mercy of God in her heart, Hannah is joyful. Now notice what I haven't said yet. I haven't said the part where God promises her and she reaps the generosity of the Lord by having that which she lacked, and that was a son whom she names Samuel. She does not have Samuel and then finds her joy, because her joy would then be completely based on her circumstances, and that is not the way of God, and that is not the way out for any of us in whatever circumstances that we're facing right now. It is God himself who heals. It is God himself who loves. It is God himself who is enough, who is sufficient for our joy, sufficient for our comfort and our peace. Hannah experiences this. And then after that, she is given what she lacks, and that is a son. We know this is true. We know that this order is intentionally given to us here in this book by the author because of what happens next. Because when Hannah has this boy, And the reason that boys and sons are valued so much in this time and place, in this culture, is because they are the ones who will inherit the work. They will the ones who will do the work in the field, who will take control of the household and look after mom and dad when they get to retirement age, right? This is the retirement plan, to have enough sons who can take over and do the work so that you can stop working in your old age and have a good, peaceful life in old age. And Hannah gives all this up. She gives it away. She gives Samuel to God. This is how we know that she gets it. And it's how we know that she, Hannah, has succeeded where Israel is going to fail. Because Israel, in their quest to need this king, this is a cultural thing for them too, isn't it? We need a king to win military victories for us. And God and Samuel say, no, you don't. You need the Lord. You need God. Hannah realizes this and says, you know what? I do need God. But the people of Israel as a whole say, no, God's fine. But what we really need is a king. And this is, I think, is an incredible juxtaposition. And there's a reason that the book of Samuel opens with Hannah's story, because she shows us what Israel should be doing. In this way, she is a type of Christ, I think. Really incredible for Hannah. Samuel is put in a very difficult position of having to speak God's judgment on Eli and his sons, but he does this. I love Samuel. I love this thing that he speaks when he's a boy and he's first called to by God. And he says, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. This is something that I have taken into my own prayer life, and I've said this many times as I start my prayer times with God. Hearing God's voice remains one of the absolute most important things that we can possibly do. I think this is the lesson that this time in Israel's history teaches us, and specifically the person of Samuel teaches us this lesson very well. The Ark of the Covenant is very interesting. The people have come to treat the Ark as a good luck charm or a secret magic weapon, haven't they? As a result, God causes it to be captured by the Philistines for two main reasons. God, number one, wants to show the Philistines themselves that he is sovereign over them and even over their gods. We have this incredible scene where he gets put in the throne room, in the treasure room, with this big statue of Dagon, the Philistine god, and then the god is knocked over and his head falls off and his arms fall off, and it's just his body left on the statue. This is more than symbolic, isn't it? But there's some heavy symbolism here too. Number two, God does this to show the Israelites that his presence and power is not confined to the ark. This is not a magic weapon. This is not a good luck charm. It is the presence of God himself that sustains his people, not this ark. Finally, I want to mention Saul. We get to Saul here in chapter 9. And the one thing I want to say about Saul this time, because we're going to talk more about Saul in the next session, but Saul has all the physical characteristics of a great leader here, doesn't he? He's tall, he's strong, he's handsome. It's everything that people think they need in a leader. This is the person God picks for them as their first king. And this is our stopping point for now. This is our cliffhanger, and we'll move into next week and see what Saul is going to do as the leader. That's it for now. Everyone have a great week. I can't wait to see you guys on Sunday. Bye for now.